We're going to start with just the idea of why is it important to access and meet with key executives. There's certainly a lot of hype and discussion, but what's behind that? And then we're going to talk a little bit about what do those executives care about? How are they different? And how should we be prepared? And really, what does that mean to meet with a key executive and have a meaningful conversation? And then we'll talk a little bit about access. How do we get more meetings? And then what do we do when we get there? So we'll introduce our ramp model and talk about each of those components as we go through, take a little journey through this conversation with key executives. But this is a fascinating area, one that's certainly not brand new, but I think there's more and interesting and developing content and approaches and information coming out about this, and it's never more important than it is today in terms of getting access. So let's start with that, David. I'd love to get feedback from our group, and if you wouldn't mind, just chat in your response here. Again, if you could change to all panelists and attendees in the drop down. And I'd like to ask the question, why is it important to meet with key executives? It's something I've heard my entire sales career. Hey, you should meet higher, you should call it the executive level. But why is that? David, curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo that. Every one of our clients, every sales manager I've ever spoken with, they all say the same thing. Hey, I tell my team they got to sell higher. And I'd be curious to see some of the reasons. What does our group today think about that?
Yeah, and I think it is important to start with the why, right? As Simon Sinek says, but we say it's important, there's a lot of hype, but thinking for ourselves, what is that going to do for us? Why is that important to our strategy? And I heard the analogy one time. They interviewed a bank robber and they said, why do you rob banks? Why do you go through all this effort? And he says, well, that's where the money is, right? And I think we can kind of think about that in terms of the responses. We meet with the key executives often because they hold budget, as several people have commented here. What else are you seeing here, David?
Yeah, I mean, also great responses here. The budget from Alex, Bev, also budget, and they own the overall business objectives. I think that's spot on. Celeste, they're the decision makers, right? They're the powers. So of course you want to meet with them. They can stop a deal and give a final yes or no. And Barry is really raising an important question, which, I don't know if we'll get to today, but really, do you meet with when's it best to meet with a key executive, early or later? That's an interesting question, way of looking at it. And they can get stuff done that others can't, from one of our participants. And I think that's true. I mean, when you meet with the person who has the authority and the power, they can really cut through the number of meetings and really compress the decision-making process.
Absolutely. So we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail. I appreciate everyone responding here. And I think we see that, they have the authority, they have the budget, they can say yes or no. So it's important to do that, but we need to do it in a way that is actually going to make a difference and at the right time. So we'll get into that as well. When we talk about being aligned in an account, so maybe this is a strategic account or we're spending some time, but we define these 4 levels of alignment. And I think it's kind of enlightening to look at this graphically. David, maybe you could take us through this. I mean, I think we've all been on this first level, right? Where you're kind of a spectator, but maybe you could walk us through this continuum.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things when people say sell higher, a lot of times, I mean, it's easy to say, but a lot of times it's important to kind of assess what's your relationship with the account and the senior person. And is it even possible to kind of break through and make that contact with that person? So, for some people, some companies, you're just a spectator. And if you think about the model that we have here, the dot that's grayed out, assume that's you. The big circle that's white, assume that's the customer. And the small white circles are your competitors. So as a spectator, you really have no relationship, with the customer, and your competitors have some level of relationship. So imagine, you get an RFP request, and literally out of the blue, and that's kind of the lowest level of alignment. Here, you're just kind of on the outside looking in.
Yeah, and I think we've all been there, right? That's when you're prospecting and you see others in there and like, wow, how would we ever break in? But let's go through this continuum. Then we're a vendor, maybe we're one of those participants, right?
Yeah, so as a vendor, you're going to be one of many. In this example, we only have three, but just assume you're one of many. And there's really nothing particularly special about your relationship. This customer is buying from numerous other competitors of yours. And, in this example, you're situated, on a level playing field with your competition.
Yeah, and I think often in that case, it's really a commodity type competition, right? There's a lot of price sensitivity. There may be RFPs or reverse auctions or things that are really forcing us into that vendor role. But we start to move up that chain. So maybe we're more of a preferred provider. What does that look like?
So in this example, you can see that you're one of few that have a special relationship with the customer. So now we've gone from three total vendors just to two. You're not more preferred than the other vendor, but both you and your competitor have some special relationship with the customer.
Yeah, and I think that obviously puts us in a better light, a better position. And then the final one, we'd like to talk about is where we're more of a trusted advisor or strategic partner. So what does that look like?
Well, you can see here that your circle, your gray circle, is actually touching or slightly overlapping with your customer. And this is the highest level of alignment. Here, you're actually in the unique position to inform the client's point of view in their decision making. And when we use the term trusted advisor or strategic partner, and those terms are very overused, that's what we mean when you think about the other level types of alignment. That you're actually perceived by your customer as almost a partner, and you're invited in very, very early into the buying process. Sometimes you're invited in before there even is a buying process, and that's why the circles are overlapping, because you're informing the strategic decisions that the company is making.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the idea, back to our question, why meet with key executives? Well, if we're there and we're in that inner circle, literally and figuratively, we are able to understand their needs better, to influence their direction, and hopefully, be that partner with them or be that consultant. So, David, let's talk about kind of some of the standard or general responses to that question. And I think we heard a lot of these in the chat, but what else would you add? Why do we access key executives?
Well, it's a little bit of chicken or the egg. I mean, you can't be a trusted advisor, right, unless you have really access to those key executives. So it's really critical to get access to create that relationship. But once you do have access and you are sharing insights with those important senior level decision makers, you are positioning yourself higher in the continuum in terms of your alignment, a strategic partner versus a mere vendor. You also are generally, once you're in that category, you're going to get higher margin sales opportunities because there's going to be less competition. They're going to say, hey, Ray, we know you, we trust you. They're not going to haggle over price. I mean, typically price is not one of the most important factors. It's always a factor, but when you look at data, when you're engaging at a very senior level, it's generally not like in the top 2 or 3 factors when they're making a decision. And this came up a lot in the chat, which is when you're talking to the person who has the power, they can make decisions so much faster. When you're talking to low and mid-level persons, it's almost like your sales process can go on and on and on. The other benefit is that you're talking to senior people, they can say, oh, hey, by the way, Ray, we have another project. Is that something you could help us with? So just the ability to create new pipeline opportunities is at an order of magnitude much higher when you're meeting with the right people. And, again, the better relationship you have with senior level people, the less competition you're going to have because you're not going to want to talk to other vendors if they trust you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And certainly there are other reasons, but if we're thinking about selling bigger deals and trying to sell higher margin business, the better ability we have to call higher can help support that. And obviously that has a direct business impact as we're doing it. So, all sorts of reasons to do it, not easy, but let's get into that a little bit and, talk about, well, who and what are the these key executives really care about. So what's important to them and how can we position ourselves? So let's get some feedback from the audience again, or from the participants here. And I'd love to understand from your perspective, from the audience perspective, what senior level executives are most important to your deals. So it's one of those things, and we've seen this across different industries and different clients, where they say, hey, call hire. You're like, great, what does that look like? Is that really a C-suite? Is it a senior director or senior executive with some other title? We're working with, health and medical companies that, boy, when you get into talking about the chief medical officer, chief nursing officer, risk mitigation, they're very different roles compared to some of our tech clients, where it's all about the chief information officer, chief technology
Yeah,
officer. We're getting some responses in, but I think we should really define for ourselves, what are those roles, and then what do they care about? What else are
right.
you seeing here, David?
Yeah, I mean, Barry is a good response. VP of Sales for Sales Enablement.
Yeah.
We're seeing Chief Risk Officer, and there's some new C-level titles. I mean, CRO is definitely a new one. Senior HR Leader, CLO, Chief Learning Officer, or it could be Chief Legal Officer. I'm not sure.
Right.
So those are all really good titles. I mean, things that our clients routinely tell us they want more access to.
Yep. Bev brings up an interesting point, and we will get to this briefly, but it implies that you have a relationship. And I should say, this really doesn't imply, first we need to identify, now we're going to talk about how do we get to that person, and using some of those access strategies. Maybe it's a coach. We can map the organization, understand who's who, and how do we navigate. But first we should understand, well, who's that ratifier or key decision maker for the deal? Who do we need to get to? Now, what's our strategy to get there? So Bev also mentions, CEO, CMO, CFO, CIO, CTO. I think those are kind of the standard C-level titles. And then, as we'll see, there's a whole nother level, I think, beyond that. So great input again. So let's talk about that. These are ones, and I think actually we identified all of these that are kind of common titles. Maybe you could talk through those, and then some of the other titles that we're seeing come up, David.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to make 2 points. One is that there's a lot of new titles here, and particularly in Chief Technology Officer, Chief Information Officer, Chief Information Security Officer, compliance people. I mean, diversity is obviously an important area. Chief Learning Officer, Chief Customer Officer. So there's been almost like this explosion of new titles in the last 5 years as business has evolved. I'd make another point, which is, as your target or your ideal client profile type company gets larger, the chances of meeting with a C-level executive go down. And I think you have to be realistic. I mean, there are certain companies that you have no chance of meeting with the CEO. It's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean there's lots of other very important people that you can meet with who just have other titles. I mean, we work with a very, very large technology company, and we're not meeting with C-level people, not even at the VP level, but the director level people we meet with have like amazing authority and access to large budgets. So I think you have to kind of look at who are you selling to, and if you're a manager or a VP or a sales leader, you can't just tell a typical salesperson, hey, go try to meet with the CEO. You have to really understand the organization and what's the right level.
Yeah, it's so important in defining that for the particular opportunity. I think, as Jose mentioned, in a small company, it may be the owner or the CEO. In a larger company, we may be down several layers, and we really need to map that organization, sketch it out. And there's nothing better than if you have a coach, as we'll talk about, that can help you kind of connect the dots and say, well, who's who and who can get us access, or how can we get to that next level up? Because whatever level it is, if we're up another level, we probably have more authority, more budget, more decision making.
Yeah, and I want to just give everyone a trigger warning. I'm about to plug a new program that we have. But just real briefly, we call it selling to key executives, not selling to the C-suite or some other form of C-suite. We talk about how to access C-suite executives, but we also want to recognize that for salespeople, the world is very complicated, and a key executive is any important executive that has budget authority or decision-making authority. So that definition is broad, by design, and can include a lot of people that don't have C in their title.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. And again, it's very specific to your target accounts, your opportunities, and what you're going after. So, let's talk about that. If we've identified the roles and maybe the short list of those executives we want to be targeting, we want to think about what they care about. And we have this idea of just impact categories. And so this is just a simple way to think about if we're mapping that organization, and we might think, chief marketing officer was on there, right? CMO. Well, they're going to be probably very interested in how an initiative impacts their image, maybe customer satisfaction, because that has to do with retention, right? They're going to be very driven by that. Whereas CFO is probably more aligned with money, right? Is it saving or costing us money? And productivity, right? Can we drive more through the current resources we have? The CEO is much more strategic and is probably thinking about the image and the competitive advantage. How do we actually advance those the vision of the company? And maybe CTO or CIO is focused on total cost of ownership, right? And productivity per IT resource. So we can start to map these, but it gives us categories to explore so that when we go in, we shouldn't have the same pitch or talking points to every executive, because they have very different purviews and they care about very different things, and they're paid to make strategic decisions within their category. I guess anything you'd add to this, David?
I think this is a really good framework for quickly thinking about, when you're a key executive. I think though, one of the things, if you have direct selling responsibility on this call, you have to really think about changing your mindset from the features of your product, which is at the tactical level, to how your solution can impact the organization-wide issues. So you really need to shift from tactical to strategic when you're thinking about what is a key executive, what do they care about? Because as you move higher up in the organization, their span of control becomes wider. They're less interested in how your solution can impact one area. They delegate that to someone else. Their issues cut across multiple departments, or maybe much broader than just one program. So for a lot of salespeople, you have to make that mindset shift. Just think about strategic issues, not tactical issues.
Yeah, and I think that could be hard. It's the question of, well, if we get the meeting, what do we talk about? It's like, well, you better be able to align your solution to what's on that executive's agenda, or what their priorities are, or you probably won't have much to talk about, or at least understand their direction and where they're headed. So we have these 5 questions that I think can be really helpful to ask yourself, or have your salespeople ask themselves, right, from the executive's perspective. So these are things that an executive might want to know when they meet with a salesperson, and might be asking themselves. And what we do know from research is, if you ask executives how productive or valuable do they think the average sales call is, about 80% of them say they're not valuable. In other words, meeting with a salesperson is not advancing their agenda. And so I think that's an interesting one to think about. So only about 1 in 5 or 20% do they say, oh yeah, that person actually had something to share. Well, the questions they're asking themselves are things like, what business outcomes can you help us achieve? So I'm that executive, the salesperson showing up, they better have some insights. They better be bringing something with them and thinking about, well, what outcomes can you really help us with? And what makes you different? So, we probably all had that question, but why you? Why are you different? You better have a clear answer about why your approach, your solution, the way you're going to help them is different than all the other options they have, and probably the other participants or partners they're already working with. And then we think, well, how will your solutions impact my organization and my stakeholders? So what value are you actually going to bring to us? What are you going to do if you are successful? And then, are you going to be somebody we want to work with? And I know I've had this conversation even with heads of procurement, risk and compliance. It's like, we want partners that we know are going to deliver, that are going to help us mitigate risk, and that are going to be in alignment with our culture and the way we want to go about doing business. So
Ray, I would say number 4 comes up a lot more. It's just amazing how many times I hear number 4 come up.
Absolutely, which is has nothing to do with your features and benefits, right? Or your specs of the product. They want to know that this is somebody that long haul, they can count on if it's more of a strategic relationship, which is what we're trying. And then the final question is, what long-term value can they derive from working with you? So is this something that you can help advance the agenda? And, I'll share, I was just hearing the analogy, and I think it's really valuable to think about. If executives are paid to make these high-level decisions, right? And if you think about the average C-level or executive income, it's hundreds and hundreds of dollars an hour that their time is worth, and they're making these decisions. Well, and as my friend Barry said, if you can help them polish their crystal ball, right? So if you can provide a little Windex to the crystal ball, they're trying to make these long-term strategic decisions. If you can help them bring some insights, polish that up, make them better decisions, now you are an advisor. So I think that's a great way to think about it. That's at Sales Mastery. There's a video that talks more about that. But I think it's a good way to think about, well, what can we bring to help them with what they're struggling with? So as we look at those 5 questions, we want to move into then how do we actually position to get those meetings and get access and then have a successful meeting, once we get there. So we're going to introduce this idea of the ramp model. And this is just a very simple framework to say, well, if we think it's valuable, we want to meet with key executives, we think there's value there, let's apply this approach. And it's a very simple acronym. We want to do all the research we can and do that even a little different than a typical sales call. But how is research important? How do we get access to those key executives? What does a meeting look like once we get there? And then what are we asking for? What's the proposal? What's the action that we're expecting that executive to do? There's nothing worse than showing up. We have a good meeting, say, oh yeah, I think they like you. They're like, well, did it advance your deal? Or did you get their sponsorship? Did they give you an introduction? What's coming out of that? So we really want to have a key action as a result of that. So let's work our way around this circle, David. And let's talk a little bit about why research. Maybe you could shed a little light on the R. Why?
Yeah, I just want to share. I have a good friend, and he used to be a very senior investment banker, and this is at a Wall Street firm that you would have heard of. And he used to tell me that he only sells to CFOs, CEOs, boards, and investors. And he used to tell me, before any meeting, for me, it's like preparing for the Super Bowl. And he would have a team of analysts. They'd come up with ideas and insights and make a highly customized presentation. And I know that a lot of people don't have like a team of analysts to do all this, but this really gets to the mindset shift that when you're meeting with a key executive, this is not a normal demo or a discovery call, right? These people are really smart. They don't necessarily want to be sold to. They want to meet with someone who's as smart as them. So you really need to start with doing extensive research. And some of the benefits of doing research is that, it may uncover reasons why they want to meet with you. Maybe you uncover that they have an acquisition strategy and you have ideas to help them with that. Maybe they're integrating an existing acquisition and having some problems in an area that you can help them with. So just doing some baseline research at the company will help you kind of understand their situation and help you kind of tailor a way of getting access. Most salespeople really don't do a lot of research. They just do it from muscle memory. Hey, I'm going on a call. I'm going to talk about my product. And if you do a lot of research and it's obvious that you've done your homework, the person you're meeting with is going to say, wow, Ray is a great salesperson. I really appreciate what he's bringing to the table. You may also uncover, very specific sales opportunities, right? I also think you have to understand, we talked about the mindset shift. Research is going to help you better understand how to align what you do with what the key executive is trying to accomplish. Obviously that's the key to all consultative selling, but it's more complicated here when you have to move from a kind of a feature-based conversation, feature benefits, to more strategic. And I think when you're able to have a conversation at the strategic level with a key executive, it really helps you build a personal relationship. That person's saying, wow, Ray is really smart. I can trust him. He knows what he's talking about. He's done his homework. He's come prepared to this meeting. and I want to meet with him again. And I think that those are all kind of tangible and intangible benefits you get from doing research.
Absolutely. And, I think the idea of triggers, and it's interesting, this just came up this morning talking about this particular program. And one of our sales professionals was researching a tech client, was reviewing their investor presentation, right? Their quarterly investor presentation. And the CEO said, it's really important to us to sell higher so that we can sell higher transaction deals and longer term relationships. It was right there in their investor presentation. So what a great connection, right? As a trigger to say, wow, in support of this, how well are your sales teams doing getting access? Do they have the skills they need? Maybe there's an opportunity to talk about that. So yeah, I think we can uncover those areas where then we can connect the dots and hopefully help them with those strategic opportunities that are on their priority list. So let's talk about some of those areas for research that we might want to dig into.
Yeah, and just remember ICP, research the industry, the company, and its people. And again, there's a level of thoroughness you need to do in your research when you're meeting with an important person. And we want to advance, let's talk about industry. And I think this is a really challenging one for people to wrap their head around, because like, how do you research an industry? So I'd like to kind of propose to the group doing, this is a common framework of pest analysis, right? P is for political, understanding kind of what's going on in the governmental realm that could be impacting the industry. If you're selling to healthcare, obviously regulations are important. Sustainability policies, environmental policies can, impact everyone, particularly say manufacturing. Tax policies can change with, a new government. So those are important. E is for economic, hey, if you're selling into financial services, what's going on with interest rates? For a lot of other businesses, inflation is now becoming a real issue, right? And how can your solution impact those areas? And what insights about the industry, what's going on in that key executives world that's being driven by some of these big factors? S is for social. A simple one was like, how did COVID impact, that could be economic and social, your customers' industry? And the consumer attitudes have maybe, depending on your industry, they could have changed radically as a result of COVID. And finally, we have technological. And this is like a big one because many industries are impacted by technology trends, right? Innovations, kind of the level of technology investment they have to make, and how those impact the business expenses. So these are all things that, if you think about an industry through this lens or this framework, it'll help you, hopefully more quickly analyze the industry and maybe try to understand what are some of the important issues that your key executive is struggling with.
No, I think that's great. And I think it's eye-opening, right, to think of it at this level. Nothing here talks about their features or requirements or even that particular project. It's what's more going on at a much more strategic level. So we'd love to get feedback from the group here. I'm just going to launch a short poll. And what we'd like to do is get your ideas. So for those key executives that you're calling on or your sales team are calling on, what categories are most impacting their industry? So is it more political, economic, social, technological? Where would you be looking? What kind of research would you be doing? I see people responding here. We'll give you a few more seconds and share the results, but it'd be interesting to see what the group has to say. I don't know, what are you thinking here, David? What kind of trends are we seeing?
I'm trying to pick one, but it's so hard because it just depends on who I'm speaking with. And I mean, I've worked a lot in the healthcare industry, and in that industry, obviously, there's regulatory change is so important. But on the technology side, we're just seeing a lot of change there. I mean, obviously. So those are the ones that I see a lot of. I'm just curious what our groups has to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's right. They're so intertwined as well. Not surprising, economic, almost 2/3 of the group here, because that's going to be the power of the budget, the pocket, and the other ones affect economic, right? So especially as we're coming out of COVID, I think we're seeing that as budgets start to maybe free up a little bit.
Bev's asking a really good question, which is, and I'm going to paraphrase, which is, have you ever seen a key executive get offended when you assume you know more about the industry or the company than them? And the answer is yes. And I think there's kind of a sensitivity about trying to, I'm going to use a term, but I don't mean this in a competitive way in our industry, but to challenge someone where if you're meeting with a C-level executive, you should be very humble when you go into that meeting and not try to tell them how to run their business or what's going on in their world, because again, a pest analysis is a framework, but they're living in that reality every day. So you should be very, very sensitive to not kind of getting ahead of yourself and assuming that you're an expert when they're living in that reality on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And we say that those conversations should be a give and get, or should be an exchange where we're not going in, preaching or dictating or telling them. We're going in saying, we did a little research and here's what we're seeing. How does that resonate, right? So you're asking an open-ended question, or are you seeing this as well? And also, I think anytime we can share an example and say, well, we had a client that was like you, or in your industry that went through this, are you seeing the same sort of thing? So I think we
Yeah,
want that to be much more of a dialogue than going in and trying to tell them, yeah, absolutely, what business they should be in.
yeah. And Celeste is again making a good point that, again, you're not trying to one up them and you're not trying to beat them in an argument. And that's not what this is about. You're trying to have a back and forth dialogue where you're their equal and you're demonstrating that you know just enough to be credible, but then letting them go next to kind of fill in the details, which there's no way, it would be very, very difficult, obviously, for you to know more than them. But there may be some exceptions. Maybe, we'll talk about it a little bit later. You may have insights based on talking to their competitors, or maybe you're selling in that industry every day and you may know more than they do in certain things.
Absolutely. Yeah, they typically don't go through a major procurement every day or bring in a partner. So let's talk
But
quickly. I know I want to be sensitive to our time here, but just in these research areas, the industry we talked about, let's talk about the company and the people side.
yeah, so just real quick, I mean, obviously the website is probably where you go to first. If the company is a US public company, on the website, they're going to have a section called Investor Relations. Go right to the most recent 10K. That's a annual report the company by law has to file with the government, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And they have to disclose in that 10K all the things that are material to investors. That means important things, right? And I want to share with you just a quick shortcut. In a prior life, I was a corporate lawyer. This is the one time I get to use that experience, in this job. Go to the management discussion and analysis section, the MD&A, because skip everything else, go there first. It'll save you a lot of time. But that's where management has to, by law, tell you, the investor, but it's available on the website, what's important. And if you read that section, if that's all you have time, you only have 20 minutes to prepare, go right to the 10K and read that section. If you're selling to a private company or a non-US based company, it would be much more difficult to find out information about the company. And in those cases, try to find investor presentations when they go to conferences, or read press releases, or, probably the best source of information would be your contacts within the company. So assuming you're not going to this opportunity completely cold, trying to get that high level of an appointment, talk to the lower level people at the company to find out what's going on. That's clearly your best source.
Absolutely. And, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think understanding the company, what's going on, like you said, they'll have to share that. And, I really like those investor presentations if they're publicly held, because that'll be the, 12 slide deck that basically recaps everything that's in their annual report, and often the 10K, what's going on and what do they want people to be aware of. So anyway, great resources for the company. We'll talk a little bit about researching people now. I'm sure salespeople in general know how to do some stakeholder research, and they're looking at the background, and maybe they can find out about a little bit about how they communicate, kind of what's personally important to them. And then as we talk about where do they fit in the organization, what are the reporting relationships, we say, can you look 2 levels up, 2 levels down, 2 levels to the side, right? You can start to understand the map a little bit more. And doing that background, we'll talk about coaches as an input of that, but can really tell us a lot about that person before we go in and meet. And just understanding, are they very to the point and they just want the facts? Or do they want to understand a little bit more about your background and your style and the relationships? How are you going to prepare for that? And then really understanding, we won't go into a ton of detail on this, but looking at the organization for that individual, how much influence do they have? And do they like us, or are they committed? Do they even know us? So, if you think about this grid, in the upper right is somebody who is very influential, has decision-making power, and is really committed to our solution. And that's going to be great. But when we start, they may be over on the left-hand side, either kind of neutral or even anti, or maybe they like our competitor. So we should really understand, for all the players we're meeting with, how do they map? Where do the arrows go? And how can we adjust accordingly? And this can just be a very valuable tool as we're starting to get a lay of the land as we go through mapping that organization. And one of the key areas to do that is with customer coaches. And I'm a big fan of that, because if we can develop those lower level relationships, those advocates who like us, and hopefully we can help them be successful, they have a vested interest in helping us, kind of by definition, if they're a good coach and we've developed, maybe we provided them insights and information that have helped them to be successful. But we can often learn a lot about those individuals. And I think it's okay to even say, hey, would you be willing to be a coach here? Can you coach me a little bit? I have this meeting coming up. What is this person about? What are they, how do they behave? What's most important to them? And even reviewing our proposal or our presentation, once you develop that coach, how valuable that can be, and both for getting access and then being prepared when we get there. So there's a lot that we can do to really research the people and the individuals and gain access. And we use that then going forward, as we're working our way around, we've done our research, we want to think about the access strategies that we can use. And what are we going to do, right, to get those meetings? Because it's not always easy. David, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because that's often the challenge, right? Is they don't want to meet with us. They have busy agendas. So what can we do to actually get access to an executive?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, from the salesperson's perspective, getting access is the hardest thing, right? I mean, and I would just say that, we obviously want to emphasize the other parts of the framework. They're as important, or can be. But if you don't have access, if you don't get the meeting, then, nothing else really matters. So, clearly the number one way of getting access is a referral. And generally the most common way is an internal referral. So that, when Ray, you were talking about a customer coach, the people, the mid-level contacts you're talking to, those are the people that are best positioned to get you a referral to a key executive. Some cases you can get a referral from like someone outside of the company, but if you've been talking to like lower, mid-level people, that's just going to be like the number one way of getting access. If you don't have those relationships, creating a reason to meet. And this is something that, you create. So maybe you say, hey, Ray, I want to meet with you. We'd love to connect and do a quarterly account review. Or maybe you say, hey, we recently acquired XYZ company and we're meeting with all of our key clients and relationships to really explain how we're going to provide you with better service because of that acquisition. Or, maybe you've come up with, you've uncovered some opportunity or some idea that you want to share. When we talk about insights, I just talked to a customer where, hey, we get a lot of C-level appointments and they want to hear what we're seeing in the industry, because that company is speaking to their competitors or, similarly situated companies, and they want to meet with that salesperson to learn, right? So if you have insights that you can share with a senior level executive, you can get meetings. That's a very effective way of getting meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anytime we can share third-party research, or maybe it's primary research that we've done, or a white paper, and say, hey, let us share what we see going on in the organization. Or as you talked about, a reason to meet could also be my chief technology officer is going to be in town and would love to brief you on what we're seeing in
Yeah.
other clients and within the industry.
I want to share a quick story. So we have a client that's a global technology company, and they sell um, ERP software. And I was talking to one of the managers in Europe, and they did a prospecting campaign. They hand wrote letters. I couldn't believe it. I mean, they did it. They sent out 100 letters to C-level executives, in their market. And what they said in the letter was, hey, we've helped a similar companies with a supply chain issue, and we've saved on average, it was like in the millions of euros. And I think the manager told me that out of 100 letters, I may have the numbers wrong, but directionally, I think I'm pretty close. I think they had a hit rate of about 50%. They literally got 50 appointments. And these were like literally at the C-level. So they came up with a reason to meet. And it was, I want to share a success story, and it will help save you money, because the success story was a company that was in a very similar situation. So I was really impressed with, it was kind of old school selling, but it was super effective because, while technology changes, people's motivation and their needs really don't change. And I think that if you can come up with a good idea, you're going to be successful in getting appointments.
Absolutely. And obviously that was one that resonated, right? Because it spoke to one of the challenges probably those executives had. I think that personal approach is huge. We're seeing a lot more personalized video, right? So a great use of a tool like Vidyard as an outbound video to say, hey, I'm just going to record this 30-second video talking about a similar situation and how we can help. Or that email, sequence, it's going to have the same components, but saying, I'd like to meet with you because we have some great ideas about how we can help and how we've helped others in your industry. So I think you need to obviously craft your own solution, but getting those meetings is obviously key. And then we think about, well, what do we do when we get there, right? And we've already talked about most executives don't feel like meetings with salespeople are that productive. So we want to, up our chances or make that more valuable. So when we get into that meeting, what does that look like? So before the meeting, and these are sales fundamentals. We always talk about having an objective, but I think it's even more important with an executive to think about what's attainable. In other words, what's reasonable for that meeting that we can achieve? Do we have a very clear outcome that we're expecting? And we talk about a key executive commitment. So it's not enough for us to say, oh, we're going to show up, we're going to ask some questions and share about our latest product roadmap. But what action do we want the key executive to take? And I think when you flip that around and ask that question, it often stumps the sales professionals, right? To say, well, I'm not sure what we're asking for, but we want a specific outcome that the key executive is going to endorse a proposal. Maybe they're going to sponsor a follow-on meeting with other key stakeholders. Maybe they're going to share their budget or their roadmap, additional information. Maybe it's just agreement for a follow-on meeting, but we should have a very specific ask before we go in there, or else we come out, we're high-fiving in the parking lot going, oh, that went great. They really like us. And it's like, well, what did we really achieve? How is that advancing our deal? And I think we often miss that. And then the final piece is just how do you know if it's successful, right? So taking that action and then measuring it. We're going to get a follow-up meeting by X date, or we're going to get them to commit on some specific level.
Yeah, Ray, and I want to add to this that, when you're meeting with a very senior person, chances are there's going to be other people in the room. They're looking to hand you off to a lower level person, right? They're going to be pressed for time. When your time's up, they're going to leave. And it's really important to have a very clear objective that you're really focusing on the entire meeting, so that when the key person leaves a meeting abruptly or gets pulled away, you know exactly what you're going to ask for, and that you don't get caught flat-footed when the meeting abruptly ends, or you get handed off to a lower level person.
Yeah, and again, we just wanted to highlight a few of the key areas, within this program. Obviously, happy to take this to a deeper level going forward. But just thinking about that during the meeting, and this is so important with a key executive, is we need to spend a little time developing rapport, but not too much, right? Their time is at a premium. They probably don't have a lot of patience for chit chat and talking about the weather or some, generic tie-in. But if we have a referral and we can say, oh, you know what, David told me to give you a call, and David said to say hi, and oh, it's great that you guys, went to law school together or whatever. That makes that common connection, and then building our credibility. And again, back to, hey, we just helped this other client that looked a lot like you, or we've been doing a lot of work in this area, or personally, I've led these projects. So you really need to build up, why are you at a level to have this conversation? And then what are you going to accomplish? The reason I want to take this 20 minutes, be very sensitive to your time, is I think we can help you in these areas. How does that sound? So you want to tie that all together. So one of the things when we get in there and we, actually start to have the meeting is the whole interrogation. We've probably seen that, right? If you show up to that executive meeting and you start asking 20 questions about their business, they're going to get pretty impatient. They already know the answers to those questions. And frankly, you probably should have known those in advance. So we think about, a typical salesperson might ask all the questions just so they can create a proposal. And, they are starting with the discovery process, and executives aren't going to have the patience or probably give you much time to do that. Where the strategic advisor is going to go in demonstrating that expertise and have that give and take, where you're sharing information, you're sharing insights, and hopefully thought provoking. You have this right where the key executive says, oh, that's a really good question, nobody asked me that, or we haven't really thought about that. So I think we need to move more strategically, do more of our homework, do our lower level discovery. So when we go in, now we're confirming and we're really focused more strategically.
Yeah, you don't want to go in and ask, so Ray, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I'll share that story. I think I've mentioned this over the years, but I did ask that question when I was in the IT consulting business, and the CIO said, you know what, I sleep just fine at night, and really my sleep habits are none of your business. And I thought, okay, I'm going to take that question off my list.
Yes.
It seems, oh, that'd be good to know if there's something that's keeping them up, but I think we need to go in and verify and say, hey, I understand these are 3 challenges facing your industry these days. How are you responding to that? Well, that's a much more engaging question than just, David, tell me which problems you have so that I can help you solve them.
Yeah, I think when you say what keeps you up at night, for me, it's my cat. It's really it's a lazy question. And I think what you're telegraphing is that you didn't really take the time to move to the right-hand side, right, of the slide. You didn't really create questions that really get me thinking about what's important to me. And that's just kind of a really lazy salesperson question. I hate it when people ask me that, because I know that they didn't really prepare for the call. And that to me is what it's signaling.
Yeah, no, great clarification. So, we've had our meeting. Hopefully it's gone well. We've uncovered what's most important to them. We've demonstrated our expertise. And now it's time to, actually propose and close on something. So we think that the elements of a good presentation are kind of based on these core components. Maybe you could just at a high level walk us through these, David.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a lot of presentation frameworks we want to really start with. And one of the things to remember before I get into it is that when you're talking about your solution, this is a conversation. This should not be a canned demo, right? Hey, hey, Ray, I know we're running out of time. I just want to walk you through a proposal. It should be a conversation, and it should be iterative and interactive. So we should talk about outcomes that were specifically articulated by the key executive to you. So they told you it's important, then repeat it back to make sure that you have it right. Don't assume that you know better, but they should have said exactly what they want. And then kind of summarize the problems and really connect your solution to those problems and how you and your company and your solution can uniquely address those problems to differentiate you from your competition. Obviously, you want to have data and case studies and proof points. One area that I think a lot of salespeople struggle with is quantifying the value of their solution. This is not easy to do. You may not be able to do it in the first meeting, but I think when you're selling at that level where they do operate in the strategic level, but also quantifying outcomes is something that's just foundational to anyone who's, any kind of senior level person. So you have to be able to do that. And I think next steps, I mean, it sounds very basic, but the CEO or any C-level or very senior person, they have so many demands on their time. You should have a very clear next step that's actionable, measurable, as you said, Ray, so that you just don't get lost and handed off and then forgotten about.
No, I think that's key. And I think if we can hit on those key components, but do it very succinctly, we'll really differentiate ourselves, right? We'll be prepared, we'll be ready. But this isn't a 40-page slide deck, and we often see that, right? We go in, we don't want to leave anything out, so we go in with all the slides, and the executive's like, I don't have time for this. And I think it was Cicero that maybe originally said it, but it's been attributed to Mark Twain and others. If I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. And
Yeah,
to me, that statement really resonates because I think it's the same for sales presentations. If I had more time, I would have created a shorter presentation. The more we know about the key executive, the more we know about the problem, the tighter we can get on that conversation. And ideally, maybe we go in with a few slides as talking points, but the best conversations are where we kind of throw those out and we have a dialogue, or we go to the whiteboard and we engage them, versus trying to flip through, oh, I've got 20 slides, I better get through these by the end so we can get to the next steps. So yeah, I think we need to be very critical and clear about what it is we're trying to accomplish. And then what do we do afterwards, David?
well, I mean, obviously we want to send them an email. We have to be really careful how we frame this email. You know, I'm not a fan of saying thank you so much for your time, because I think we want to position the email as we're equals. I want to say thank you for your input. Thank you for sharing your ideas. Thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your contribution of ideas. Because now I'm psychologically positioning myself as someone who belongs in the room, right? I belong in the Super Bowl. I'm not a pretender.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's just an important mindset to have. I mean, obviously you want to summarize what happened and really what are the next steps. If you get handed off to a low-level person, I really recommend you saying, hey, I know that you handed me off to Ray, but I'd like to reconnect with you to kind of, let you know how that meeting went. So always look for some level of continuance with the senior person, even if you get handed off. I also like the idea in a follow-up email to provide something extra. So if you have a case study, hey, I thought you might be interested in this research report, in this article, in this case study, here's a link to some piece of information that we touched on. I thought you might be interested. Again, you're really positioning yourself as someone who's, meeting the key executive for the right reasons, that you're providing insights and information that they otherwise wouldn't have. And that's really why they value meeting with you.
No, it's so important. I think that clear, probably pretty short, right, email, but it recaps what you said and getting it out quickly so they don't forget, you don't forget, and it kind of lays out what you're going to do going forward. Just a very professional way to wrap that up. So, we've covered a lot of ground here. We're coming up on the top of the hour, but where we started was really this idea of even why sell to the key executives, why is it important, what value can we get from that, and becoming more of a strategic partner, right, within that circle, and changing our mindset to think more like an advisor, and how can we bring in the information we need to help them with that, and then applying this RAMP framework, the research, access, meet, and propose, to have a successful meeting and follow up.